So the Female Athlete Triad is comprised of 3 interrelated components. Those consist of low energy availability with or without disordered eating, and I'll get into more detail about that. Irregular periods, so that might be either missed periods or missed periods during heavier bouts of training or more intense training, or absent periods. So maybe an athlete has a delay in their first period, and we kind of define that as anything after the age of 15. And then the last one is impaired bone health. So that might be low bone mineral density, which is one measure of bone health that we usually measure in the clinic. That could be, depending on the population, osteopenia or osteoporosis, maybe some definitions that you've heard out in the community. And that can all be on a spectrum. And so we try to create these different types of figures and graphics. I'm sure you'll share that this does fall on the spectrum. So an athlete may have 1 or 2 components of the triad that are maybe more severe, and then the secondary consequences, if not treated, can lead to more severe consequences down the road. So it's really important to recognize some of these early signs of the triad before they get too severe, because that will lead to potentially more serious injuries, more time away from sports, and both issues kind of in the short term as well as in the long term in regards to even just overall bone health. Let's talk about low energy availability. This can be a combination. This can be either just an athlete is increasing her training volume and not matching her fueling needs. So potentially underfueling and overtraining, or some combination of those. Or it can be an actual kind of restrictive eating pattern. So maybe an athlete is limiting the amount of food that she's taking in throughout the day in order to hit a certain weight or look a certain way. Or maybe there's external pressures to kind of fit this certain athlete's look or physique that has been a misconception in the past as far as what is expected of that athlete. And that leads to those disordered eating behaviors. And so that leads to an energy mismatch, and that can affect the hormones in the body. So number 1 is that low energy availability with or without disordered eating. And like I said, it doesn't have to be a more serious eating disorder, but it can get to that point. And we have seen athletes get to that point. And that's when things get a lot more concerning as far as the potential health consequences. Number 2 is kind of talking about the hormones. So this is now we're kind of talking about the periods. So when that energy mismatch happens, that leads to effects on different hormonal systems. So it affects certain systems in the brain, which release hormones that help regulate specifically estrogen levels. And when estrogen levels go down, that can directly affect multiple systems in the body, one of which affects the bones. So when the low energy availability happens, you get this cascade or kind of blunting of certain hormones. And that blunting also leads to a loss of periods. And so that's why we ask athletes about periods and if they're regular. And that's an early sign that something's off. And that can lead to an earlier intervention and allow us to really ask some more deeper questions about their training and their nutrition. So that's number 2 is the irregular periods. Number 3 is the impaired bone health. So when we talk about low bone mineral density, what does that mean? So as physicians, we measure bone mineral density through dual energy X-ray absorptiometry machine. It's a big word. We also call it a DEXA scan, and that measures bone mineral density. So that's our main way to measure bone health. But other ways that we can determine if bone health is impaired is if an athlete presents with certain types of injuries. Bone stress injuries or stress fractures or stress reactions are due to increased load to the bone, or the integrity of the bone is not healthy. And so with this triad, the 3rd component is impaired bone health due to that lack of estrogen. So the estrogen being low impairs the ability for the bones to remodel properly. And so that means that there's greater bone breakdown and less bone formation. And if you think about athletes who are putting so much pressure and impact onto their bones, when there is something off, including a hormonal imbalance that's going to directly affect the bone, that's going to put them at greater risk of those types of bone injuries. And they can present as an actual fracture. It can be even something as minor as shin splints. And so those are things that you want to keep in mind as maybe some early signs that there could be some other kind of underlying issues at play that could be affecting the bones. Childhood and adolescence is a really important time for an athlete to build their bone mass, and peak bone mass is usually attained during childhood and adolescence and is a major determinant of bone mass throughout the years and fracture risk later in life. So we build about 90% of our peak bone mass by the age of 18. And if a young adult's bone mineral density is just 10% higher than the mean, it can potentially decrease that fracture risk and delay the age of crossing the osteoporosis threshold by 13 years. So really, and if an athlete's in her adolescent years, I think it's important to think about that this has long-term effects. It's not just the short-term potential injury risk that underfueling can affect the periods, can affect the bones, and maybe they may lose a season. They may experience these manifestations down the road too. And so even an athlete in her 20s could potentially try to regain some of that bone mass, but it gets a lot harder once an athlete hits her 30s and 40s. So I think it's important that it starts young, then an athlete needs to continue to think about this and the energy balance throughout her lifetime as an athlete. And I really am a strong advocate for longevity in sports, whether it may not be the same sport, but I hope that early habits can lead to long-term activity without increased injury risk. Whatever their energy output is based on the sport or based on even the type of season is super important. Disordered eating habits such as kind of skipping meals, maybe not eating breakfast before a morning workout. Those are things that maybe an athlete doesn't even realize is important to both maintain that good metabolism throughout the day, but also to just maintain even just good energy levels. And they're going to feel better if they have that morning breakfast or that breakfast before their morning workout. Being unhappy with body type. And I think we've seen this a lot in the media lately as far as fat shaming and coaches maybe putting too much pressure on athletes to look a certain physique. And that can really manifest into disordered eating behaviors that take years and years to really address and kind of repair some of those issues that could have been tackled earlier. Striving for perfectionism. And I know as athletes, it's very common that kind of type A, very dedicated, gritty personality just really comes through. And that's important to be successful, but you can also take that to the extreme and be so rigid with diet and training, and it can fall along that kind of scary line of being too at risk of not meeting those energy needs. Believing that losing weight will improve performance, especially in some of those endurance sports where leaner is faster, and that's not the case. I think an athlete may get away with it for us, maybe even a whole season, but at some point those injuries unfortunately do kind of catch up, and the hormones will go out of balance and their injury risk will go up, or their performance will decline due to just kind of general fatigue. And then there are certain sports that are at higher risk, especially those that favor a lean body size or shape: gymnastics, figure skating, distance running, sports that have weight classes like rowing, sports that have revealing uniforms like swimsuits or volleyball. But it doesn't mean if an athlete's not involved in those sports, it doesn't mean that they're at risk. And I've seen soccer players, basketball players, all kind of fall into these disordered eating behaviors that put them at risk of for the triad. So I think it's really important to recognize these both as coaches and parents to really just try and find ways to prevent and have a really open dialogue with the team about maybe some of these behaviors that they're noticing within the team and try to correct those and educate.